The schoolhouse bell hadn't rung in 3 days. Rebecca Lane stood in the empty classroom, watching dust motes dance through broken sunlight, each speck a reminder of dreams settling into nothing. Prairie Bluff was dying the slow death of forgotten places, and she was watching its heart stop beating. The children's desks sat like tombstones in neat rows, waiting for a resurrection that required more than prayer. Outside, Caleb Thornton's land stretched green and defiant against the drought, a kingdom built on secrets she'd never dared to ask about. Today, she would swallow her pride like bitter medicine and knock on his door. The morning sun cast long shadows across the schoolyard as Rebecca Lane swept the front steps for what might be the last time. Each stroke of the broom felt like a prayer, each gathered pile of dust a small defeat. The school board's letter lay folded in her apron pocket, its words burned into her memory. Insufficient funds, closure effective end of month. 23 children would scatter like tumbleweeds, their futures as uncertain as the next rain. She paused, leaning against the broom handle, and gazed across the valley toward the Thornton ranch. Even from this distance, she could see the green pastures that defied the drought, the cattle that grazed fat and content while the rest of Prairie Bluff withered. Caleb Thornton had built something that lasted, something that thrived when others merely survived. The townspeople spoke of him in whispers, the widower who'd turned grief into gold, who'd never remarried despite the parade of hopeful women who'd tried to catch his eye. Rebecca had taught his daughter Emma for 2 years, watching the quiet girl struggle with letters that seemed to dance away from her understanding. The child was bright, curious, but something held her back, a shyness that ran deeper than mere introversion. Emma would sit in the back corner, her father's dark eyes watching the world with careful distance, as if she'd learned too young that caring too much led to loss. The sound of approaching hoofbeats broke through her reverie. Mrs. Henderson from the general store rode up on her old mare, her face grim with the weight of bad news. "Rebecca, dear," she called out, dismounting with the careful movements of someone whose bones remembered better days. "I've just come from the bank. Mr. Whitmore says there's no extension possible. The mortgage payment is due in full by Friday, or—" She didn't need to finish the sentence. Rebecca felt the words hit her like a physical blow. Friday was 3 days away. 3 days to find money that didn't exist, to save a dream that was slipping through her fingers like sand. She thought of the children, little Tommy who just learned to read, Sarah who showed such promise with numbers, Emma Thornton who needed more time to find her voice. They deserved better than to have their education scattered to the wind because adults couldn't make the numbers work. As Mrs. Henderson rode away, Rebecca stood alone in the schoolyard, the weight of impossible choices settling on her shoulders. The Thornton ranch beckoned in the distance, a green oasis in a brown world, and she knew what she had to do. Pride was a luxury she could no longer afford, not when the future of Prairie Bluff's children hung in the balance like a rope about to snap. The walk to the Thornton ranch felt longer than the actual 3 miles, each step weighted with the knowledge that she was about to expose her desperation to a man who'd never shown weakness to anyone. Rebecca had changed into her best dress, the blue one with tiny flowers that her mother had sewn for her teaching position, but it felt inadequate against the magnitude of what she was about to ask. The sun climbed higher, and sweat beaded on her forehead despite the autumn chill that promised an early winter. The Thornton property began where the dying grass gave way to irrigated green, a border as clear as a line drawn in the earth. Cattle lifted their heads to watch her pass, their eyes curious but unafraid. Everything here spoke of careful tending, of resources managed with wisdom rather than desperation. The fences were straight and strong, the barn painted and maintained, the house itself a testament to prosperity built on something more solid than luck. As she approached the front porch, Rebecca caught sight of Emma through a window, bent over what looked like a book. The girl's brow was furrowed in concentration, her lips moving silently as she worked through words that clearly challenged her. Rebecca's heart clenched with familiar teacher's instinct, the desire to help, to guide, to unlock the potential she could see, trapped behind the child's careful reserve. This was why she was here, she reminded herself. Not for her own pride, but for children like Emma, who needed more than Prairie Bluff could currently offer. The front door opened before she could knock, and Caleb Thornton stepped onto the porch. He was taller than she remembered, his shoulders broad beneath a work shirt that had seen honest labor. His dark hair was touched with silver at the temples, and his eyes, the same deep brown as his daughter's, held a wariness that spoke of a man who'd learned to be careful with trust. He didn't speak immediately, just studied her with the patient attention of someone accustomed to reading the land and weather for signs of what was coming. "Miss Lane," he said finally, his voice carrying the rough warmth of a man who spent more time talking to horses than people. "This is unexpected." There was no judgment in his tone, but no invitation either. He was waiting, she realized, for her to explain why the schoolteacher had walked 3 miles to stand on his porch, looking like she'd rather be anywhere else in the world. Rebecca straightened her shoulders and met his gaze directly. "Mr. Thornton, I need to speak with you about something important, about the school, and about Emma." She saw something shift in his expression at his daughter's name, a softening that was quickly controlled, but not before she caught it. "I know you're a busy man, but if you could spare a few minutes, I believe what I have to say might interest you." The words came out steadier than she felt, carrying the authority she'd learned to project in front of a classroom full of restless children. He stepped back and gestured toward the door, a gesture that felt like the first step across a bridge she wasn't sure would hold her weight. The schoolhouse felt different when Rebecca returned the next morning, as if the very walls had shifted during her absence. Sunlight streamed through the cracked windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny spirits above the empty desks. She moved through the familiar space with deliberate slowness, her fingers trailing along the worn wooden surfaces, memorizing textures she might soon lose forever. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was expectant, holding its breath for news that could either resurrect this place or seal its tomb. She had told no one about her visit to Caleb Thornton, not even Martha, whose worried questions had followed her home like persistent shadows. The weight of his promised help sat heavy in her chest, a gift wrapped in uncertainty that she couldn't quite bring herself to unwrap. When the children arrived, their voices seemed muted, as if they too sensed the fragile nature of their gathering. Little Sarah Martinez clutched her slate with white knuckles, while Tommy Henderson kept glancing toward the door, as though expecting someone to burst in and announce the school's closure. Rebecca watched them settle into their seats with the careful attention of someone memorizing a moment, noting how the morning light caught in Emma's golden braids, how young Peter's tongue poked out in concentration as he formed his letters. These children had become more than students to her. They were the living proof that education could take root, even in the hardest soil, that knowledge could bloom in the most unlikely places. The thought of failing them, of watching their eager faces disappear behind the veil of ignorance that poverty so often drew, made her throat tighten with unshed tears. The morning lessons proceeded with mechanical precision, but Rebecca's mind wandered to the conversation that awaited her. Caleb had promised to visit the school, to see for himself what his money might preserve, and the anticipation made her skin feel too tight, her movements too careful. She found herself straightening papers that didn't need straightening, adjusting books that were already perfectly aligned, her nervous energy seeking outlet in meaningless tasks. When she caught herself smoothing her skirt for the 3rd time, she forced her hands to stillness and focused on young Timothy's halting recitation of his multiplication tables. The boy's struggle with numbers reminded her why this fight mattered, not for her own pride or position, but for the futures that hung in the balance like fruit on a dying tree. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made every head in the classroom turn toward the windows. Rebecca's heart performed an irregular rhythm against her ribs as she recognized the distinctive gait of Caleb's black stallion, the same horse that had carried him away from her desperate plea just yesterday. She smoothed her expression into professional calm, though her pulse hammered against her throat like a caged bird seeking freedom. The children's whispers rose like steam from a kettle, their excitement palpable as they craned their necks to catch a glimpse of the man whose reputation preceded him like thunder before lightning. Rebecca moved to the window, her reflection ghost-like in the glass, and watched as Caleb dismounted with the fluid grace of a man born to the saddle. He stood for a moment in the schoolyard, his gaze sweeping across the weathered building with the assessing eye of someone who understood the language of decay and neglect. The morning sun cast long shadows across his face, emphasizing the sharp angles of his cheekbones and the determined set of his jaw. Rebecca felt a strange flutter in her stomach, a sensation she couldn't quite name but recognized as dangerous. When his eyes found hers through the window, the connection felt electric, charged with possibilities that had nothing to do with money or schools or practical arrangements. She stepped back from the glass, her cheeks warming under his steady regard, and turned to face her students with a composure that felt as fragile as spun sugar. The knock on the door came soft but firm, and Rebecca's voice caught slightly as she called for him to enter. Caleb filled the doorway like a force of nature contained in human form, his presence immediately shifting the energy of the room from nervous anticipation to something deeper, more primal. The children fell silent, their young faces turned toward him with the mixture of awe and curiosity that adults inspired in those still young enough to believe in heroes and villains. Rebecca felt the weight of the moment settle around them like dust after a windstorm, heavy with the knowledge that whatever happened next would change everything, for the school, for the children, and perhaps most dangerously of all, for herself. Caleb's boots echoed against the worn floorboards as he stepped into the schoolroom, each footfall deliberate and measured like a man crossing sacred ground. His hat came off in a gesture so automatic it spoke of deep-rooted manners, revealing hair the color of autumn wheat touched by early frost. Rebecca watched the children's faces transform from wariness to fascination as they took in this legendary figure who had materialized in their humble classroom like a character stepped out of one of their storybooks. The air itself seemed to thicken with unspoken questions and barely contained energy, as if the very walls were leaning in to witness this unprecedented meeting between their world and his. She found herself cataloguing details she had no business noticing. The way his shirt stretched across broad shoulders, the calluses on his hands that spoke of honest labor despite his wealth, the surprising gentleness in his eyes as they settled on the children's upturned faces. "Miss Lane," he said, and her name sounded different in his deep voice, weighted with a respect that made her spine straighten involuntarily. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." The irony of his words wasn't lost on her. Everything happening in this room was important, from Tommy's struggle with reading to Sarah's careful penmanship, each small victory a thread in the fabric of their community's future. She gestured toward the children with a pride that surprised her in its fierceness, these young minds that had become her responsibility and her joy. "Children, this is Mr. Thornton," she announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had learned to command attention from the most reluctant audiences. "He's here to see how we spend our days." The formal introduction felt inadequate somehow, failing to capture the magnitude of what his presence might mean for all of them. The children's responses varied like wildflowers in a meadow, some bold, others shy, all curious. Little Emma raised her hand with the confidence of someone accustomed to being heard, her voice clear as a bell when she asked, "Are you really the richest man in Prairie Bluff?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a campfire, direct and uncompromising in the way only children could manage. Caleb's laugh was unexpected, a rich sound that seemed to surprise even him, and Rebecca felt something tight in her chest loosen at the genuine warmth in his expression. "I suppose that depends on how you measure riches," he replied, crouching down to Emma's level with an ease that spoke of experience with children. "What do you think makes someone rich?" The question turned the tables with gentle skill, and Rebecca found herself leaning forward, as curious as her students to hear the answer. As the morning progressed, Rebecca watched Caleb move through her classroom with the careful attention of someone genuinely interested in understanding what he saw. He examined the children's work with the same focus she'd seen him apply to livestock and land deals, asking questions that revealed a sharp mind beneath his quiet exterior. When young Peter struggled with a particularly difficult word, Caleb knelt beside his desk and worked through it with a patience that made Rebecca's heart perform strange acrobatics in her chest. The sight of this powerful man bent over a child's primer. His voice, gentle as he sounded out syllables, created an image that would linger in her memory long after he left. There was something profoundly moving about watching him discover the magic that happened within these walls every day, the small miracles of learning that she had devoted her life to nurturing. The moment that changed everything came when Timothy, emboldened by Caleb's approachable manner, asked if he knew how to read. The question fell into the room like a stone into still water, creating ripples of silence that spread outward until even the youngest child seemed to hold their breath. Rebecca felt her heart stop, then restart with a painful thud as she watched Caleb's face transform, vulnerability flickering across his features like lightning in a summer sky. The admission, when it came, was quiet but clear. "Not as well as I should." The words hung between them, heavy with implications that made Rebecca's throat tighten with unexpected emotion. In that moment, she understood that his offer of help wasn't just about charity or community obligation. It was about something deeper, more personal, a hunger that money couldn't satisfy. The silence stretched until Rebecca found her voice, her teacher's instincts overriding her shock. "Learning has no age limit," she said softly, the words carrying more weight than their simple construction suggested. "The desire to grow, to improve oneself, that's the most valuable thing any of us can possess." She watched Caleb's shoulders straighten slightly, saw something like hope kindle in his eyes, and felt the ground shift beneath her feet in ways that had nothing to do with the schoolhouse's uncertain foundation. When he looked at her then, really looked at her, she saw past the wealthy farmer's facade to the man beneath, proud, wounded, hungry for something he'd never allowed himself to want. The realization hit her like a physical blow. His bold request wasn't coming. It was already here, written in the vulnerable set of his mouth and the way his hands trembled almost imperceptibly as he reached for one of the children's books. The afternoon sun slanted through the schoolhouse windows, painting golden rectangles across the floor, where dust motes danced like tiny spirits, celebrating some invisible victory. The children had been dismissed an hour ago, their voices and laughter fading into the distance like echoes of a song Rebecca wasn't ready to stop hearing. She moved through the empty classroom with deliberate slowness, erasing the day's lessons from the blackboard, with strokes that felt more like benedictions than simple cleaning. Caleb remained seated at one of the small desks, his large frame comically folded into the child-sized furniture, but his expression was anything but amusing. It held the gravity of a man standing at the edge of a cliff, measuring the distance to the other side. The silence between them had weight and texture, filled with all the words they hadn't yet found the courage to speak. When Rebecca finally turned to face him, the chalk dust still clinging to her fingers like powdered hope, she found him studying her with an intensity that made her skin warm under her modest dress. "The children adore you," he said quietly, his voice carrying undertones she couldn't quite decipher. "I can see why the thought of losing this place tears at you." His words were simple, but they carried the weight of understanding. of someone who had looked beneath the surface and seen the true cost of failure. Rebecca felt her throat tighten with emotion she'd been holding back all day, the careful composure she'd maintained in front of her students finally beginning to crack like ice under spring sun. "They deserve better than what I can give them," she admitted, the confession scraping against her pride like sandpaper against raw wood. "Better books, better supplies, a building that doesn't leak when it rains." Caleb rose from the desk with fluid grace, his movement stirring the dust-laden air and bringing with it the scent of leather and something indefinably masculine that made Rebecca's pulse quicken despite her best efforts to remain professional. "What if I told you that helping them might help me too?" he asked, his words careful and measured like a man walking across thin ice. The question hung between them, loaded with implications that made Rebecca's heart perform irregular rhythms against her ribs. She watched his face, noting the way his jaw tightened with what looked like nervous determination, the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides, as though he were preparing for battle. "I don't understand," she said softly, though part of her suspected she understood all too well, and the knowledge both thrilled and terrified her in equal measure. The confession, when it came, emerged like water from a long dry well, hesitant at first, then flowing with increasing urgency. "I never learned to read properly," Caleb said, his voice rough with the effort of admission. "My father believed books were for weak men, that the land would teach me everything I needed to know. By the time I realized how wrong he was, I was too proud to admit my ignorance, too set in my ways to change." Rebecca felt her heart break a little at the pain in his voice, at the image of a young boy, denied the gift of literacy, growing into a man haunted by the gaps in his education. "I've built an empire on instinct and determination," he continued, "but I watch other men conduct business with papers I can barely decipher. And I know I'm only half the man I could be." The request, when it finally came, was delivered with the same quiet intensity he'd shown when examining her students' work. But underneath lay a vulnerability that made Rebecca's chest ache with sympathy. "Teach me," he said simply, the two words carrying the weight of a lifetime's worth of hidden shame and desperate hope. "Not just me, my daughter too. She's 8 years old and bright as a new penny, but I can't help her with her lessons the way a father should." The image he painted of a powerful man humbled by his own limitations, of a little girl whose education hung in the balance, struck Rebecca with the force of a physical blow. She thought of all the children she'd taught over the years, but none had ever needed her quite like this, with such raw honesty and desperate courage. The silence that followed stretched between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed, and Rebecca felt the weight of decision settling on her shoulders like a mantle she wasn't sure she was strong enough to bear. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady despite the chaos in her heart. "Yes," she said, the single word carrying more promise than any elaborate speech could have managed. "Yes, I'll teach you both." "Nee." The relief that flooded Caleb's face was so profound it took her breath away, and when he stepped closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, she felt something fundamental shift in the space between them. "Thank you," he whispered, and the gratitude in his voice was so raw, so genuine, that Rebecca knew she would have agreed to anything he asked, consequences be damned. In that moment, standing in the golden light of the dying day, she understood that she had just agreed to much more than reading lessons. She had opened the door to a future she couldn't yet imagine, one that promised to change everything she thought she knew about herself, about him, and about the dangerous territory that lay between helping someone and falling for them completely.